All right, it is May 30, 2025. Welcome to Borderlines, and we are joined in what should be a very interesting and special episode by Ali Ansahari and Kaveh Shahrooz. Ali Ansahari is an immigration lawyer in Toronto with a focus on complex cases. I think you're going to be speaking next week at the CBA conference in Victoria on removals. So thanks for coming on, Ali. And Kaveh Shahrooz is a senior fellow with the McDonald Institute and a human rights lawyer.
I hate to do this, Steve, but I think you pronounced his name wrong. It's Esnaashari, isn't it?
It's Esnaashari. The double vowel
Esnaashari.
throws
Yeah.
everybody off.
I'm not trying to call you out, Steve. I'm just like, there is a bit of a ritual of Steve butchering names and stuff like that. Like, he's a very fine man, but.
And what we are talking about today is the immigration consequences of the designation of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. I think I got that right. I've been struggling with that acronym for about 2 years. If it's the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, is the Islamic, and the designation of them as a terrorist organization and the immigration consequences of that. We've talked a little bit or hinted about this in some of our yearly predictions when there was pressure by the conservatives on the liberals and other organizations to designate the IRGC a terrorist organization. And now we are seeing the immigration consequences of this. And we were actually contacted by an organization to have both of you on to sort of explain both the background of the IRGC, some of the public policy considerations, and what is going on. We have, when I said that we were doing this episode on Twitter, we probably got more questions and comments on this than on any other topic that we've been preparing. One of which I just want to address up front because I got some emails. I said that we would be talking about inadmissibility due to membership in the IRGC. And a lot of people wrote to me emphatically to say that they were not members, they were conscripts. And I probably should have been clear in the tweet that I did when I said we were doing this episode. I didn't mean to prejudge the immigration implications or that people were members. I probably should have used the word served in the IRGC. So yeah, why don't we get
involuntarily to the IRGC? Yeah.
Served involuntarily. So why don't we get started with maybe Kaveh, you can kind of just walk us through like what is the background of the IRGC? What is the IRGC?
Sure. Yeah, the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and it's interesting that you said that you struggle with the name, whether it's Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps or Islamic, and there is actually significance to that. The IRGC is a military force that serves as sort of a parallel army in Iran. Its name is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps because it is not designed to protect Iran. That's not the reason why this entity exists. It exists to protect the Islamic Revolution. Its purpose is to keep the current Iranian regime in place. And it has done this in the past 4 decades in a variety of ways. It was very involved in the Iran-Iraq War initially, that occurred in the 80s. But ever since then, it has become this sort of arm of the Iranian regime. It is engaged in carrying out its repression at home. Anytime that protesters take to the streets, which has occurred many times over the life of this regime, and is occurring more and more frequently in the past decade or so, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is there to crush any sort of dissent. It is also an institution that is designed to export the revolution abroad. So it has been responsible for connecting with Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis and other groups across the world. It has been responsible for carrying out a number of terror attacks in all sorts of places around the world, both in the Middle East region, but also far beyond it, including places like Argentina, where it's alleged that the IRGC was responsible for a bombing of a Jewish community center, and places like India, Indonesia, all across the world. Canadians may have come across the IRGC first back in 2020 because the IRGC is implicated in shooting down Ukraine International Flight PS752. That was a plane that was shot down by the IRGC over Iran killing a number of people, 176 people to be exact, many of whom were Canadian citizens or permanent residents. They were on their way to Ukraine to catch a flight to come back to Canada, and the IRGC shot down that flight, and it tried to cover it up, and since then it has refused to cooperate with any sort of investigation. And it's an incredibly brutal organization. It's responsible for a lot of killing both at home and abroad, and it's also an immensely corrupt organization. So not only is it militarily involved in Iran, it also is a major economic player that basically controls much of the Iranian economy.
And so how does it work in terms of like conscription and like military service? How does that funneling happen?
Yeah, so when an Iranian male of a certain age is ready for doing the mandatory military service, there is a process by which it's determined where they go to serve, and some of it I think is luck, some of it is people making certain choices, and they could end up in the traditional Army, Navy, Air Force, or they can end up in the IRGC, which itself has sort of all these parallel things. It has an air force, it has a sort of ground military force, has a navy, and so on. So that's how people end up doing their 2-year conscription service with the IRGC.
Because it's pretty big, right? Like, I think I was reading on Wikipedia that the IRGC is about 200,000 people at any given time, and that the rest of the Iranian army is about 350, 400,000-ish. So it's your odds of getting conscripted seem into the IRGC seem to be about 1 in 3.
Yeah, something like that. I mean, those numbers, I can't say for sure that's right, but it sounds about right to me. It's a major power. It is really, in Iran, it's the power behind the power. It's the thing that holds up the Iranian regime, and it's very large, and it conscripts young men into its system. And it's the organization that's much more dedicated to preserving the regime. Yeah.
And can you get into, so like one of the things that I don't think I fully appreciated until I started researching this episode was that the IRGC-QF, the Quds Force, and I hope I pronounced that right, has been designated since 2012.
Correct.
And so what is the distinction between the IRGC as a whole and the Quds Force? And sort of as a follow-up question to that, like, I noticed that Israel has designated the Quds Force as a terrorist organization, but not the IRGC as a whole.
That's super.
I'm just trying to understand sort of the, like, what is the Quds Force? Why, I don't know if you know, why hasn't Israel designated the whole IRGC as a terrorist organization? You'd think that would be the country that would be the most keen to.
Yeah. I don't actually know the answer to that. That's a very interesting question, and I have no idea what the thinking was in Israel around this. But the Quds Force is basically the arm of the IRGC that's focused on operations abroad. So when you hear about the IRGC, working with Hamas or working with Hezbollah, that's the Quds Force. And its leader was a guy named, currently it's somebody else, but its most famed leader was a person named Qasem Soleimani. He was a general in the IRGC, and he was famously killed in Iraq by a U.S. bombing in 2020. I want to say, actually very shortly before that plane was shot down, PS752 was shot down. So the international community, I think, recognized fairly early on that the Quds Force is a menace, and it has been listed as a terrorist organization in a number of places, Canada, the US, and elsewhere, for a number of years. But the Quds Force is really part and parcel of this whole entity. It's really difficult to kind of, in my view, designate one part of it as a terror organization and not the rest of it. The whole thing really works together, and we have to view it as one institution rather than as separate parts.
And one other thing, which is when somebody is conscripted, if they're conscripted to the IRGC and do not wish to be conscripted, how much say do they have over?
I think very little. I don't think the young men get to determine where they do their military service. Now, they may try to game the system. They may use whatever leverage they have to go to, one institution or another. But once that determination is made, I don't think there's really a way to change what you've been designated to do.
And what would happen if they just refused?
That's actually a great question. I can't say the exact penalties that are set out in Iranian law, but I think like any place that has rules around mandatory military service, there is punishment, possibly, fines or prison time. Yeah.
Yeah, I've looked into that a little bit because I'm working on some of these cases. I mean, there's stuff in the law that you can talk about, the punishments that exist. And then there's also really the reality that you're serving mandatory military service in a country that is a dictatorship that is known for torturing people and unlawfully detaining people, arresting people. It's one of those things you mess around and you find out, right? Yeah. So a lot of people, you're not even going to dare. Yeah.
Yeah.
And just to add to what Kaveh said, one of the things that is really fascinating about IRGC, and maybe it's going to be a bit difficult to wrap your head around it if you haven't lived in that country, is that it's not just the military. Like Kaveh said, they're a huge player in the economic side, and also any of the major players when it comes down to anything related to infrastructure. So I'm talking about, for example, cellular service, right? Imagine if you have equivalent of Rogers in Iran, right? 25% or something like that would be owned by IRGC. Any of the major banks, IRGC is going to have some kind of ownership. So you really can't interact with any major institution in Iran and get away from IRGC, because like Kaveh said, they are the power behind power and they want to have their hands in everything. So it is not just military, but on all aspects of life, you're going to run into them.
So that part of someone's conscription, we were talking in a recent episode about Connie, that when it comes to figuring out the top half of, we were mentioning the Iranian military or government, that you'll meet people who served in the Iranian military with the title of second lieutenant or something, which seems senior. And you ask, what did you do as part of your service? And it was, I taught English at this university for the whole thing. Is that similar with the IRGC? Like, it sounds like you're saying there'd be a wide range of roles. Like, they have a Coast Guard. From what
they've got everything. And I think, one of the things that perhaps makes the IRGC appealing as a place to go do your military services, that you can do, if you're a doctor, if you're studying to become an engineer, you can go and do those things as a conscript in the IRGC. So I mean, and I'm sure we'll get into this discussion later. To build on the point that Ali was making, one of the issues with just listing the IRGC as a terror group, is as we have done it in Canada right now, is that listing is both over and under inclusive. It includes people who really have no ties to the regime, that were just forced to go and serve, but it's also under inclusive because precisely for the reason Ali said, I have friends, for example, that built businesses in Iran. They're entrepreneurs. And once your business gets big enough, the IRGC just shows up and says, we would like some board seats and some equity in your company. And if you, if you say no to that, life is going to become much more difficult for you. So there are sectors that are not sort of military focused; they're just economic, but they are IRGC entities. So it's hard to design a sanction that captures that economic arm, but also leaves alone people that were conscripted to serve in the military side.
Yeah, I've heard the comparison that it's replaced the clerics almost as the authority. Kind of similar way to like the People's Republic of China, except it's not it's also a military force.
Just on what you were saying, I was listening to that episode actually, and I was very interesting because IRGC does work that way. Again, like Kaveh said, there's a lot of things that goes into how you get assigned once your conscription starts. And again, young men have very little control over it. But one of the things that happens, if you turn 18, you're supposed to go and do your mandatory military service. But if you're going to a post-secondary school, right, the rule generally is you get to finish your post-secondary school, right? So let's say you go study bachelor's, you can delay it for 4 years. If you go study master's, another 2. If you go PhD, then more. And then the other thing that happens is that I don't know exactly the specific rules around it, but those with higher education end up getting these higher ranks that has nothing to do really with their responsibilities, really. Right. But if you come in as a master's student to do your military service, you're going to be seen as second lieutenant or something like that.
Right.
Which has nothing to do, and your job is to water the plants. Right. So
it's like the comment Connie made that it might be because they need to pay you more because you're a doctor, but like it doesn't mean that you're like more senior in terms of the determinations you're making to the.
I think many militaries are structured like that, where the
for sure.
higher education you have implies that you're probably going to be in the officer corps. I used to be in the Canadian Reserves, and during basic training, people always used to joke like, oh, you're a college kid, you're going to want to be an officer and not like one of us privates. I think that's common to many militaries. The other thing that I've found in representing or interacting with Iranian clients is that it doesn't seem like there's actually a document that says that they were in the IRGC. As far as I understand, is that your understanding too, Ali or Kaveh, that it will say that they served in the military, but a lot of people don't seem to actually have a card that specifically says IRGC.
So you can get on the military card. On the military card, it does not say, right? It doesn't matter where you serve. Your military card, the more recent ones. If you see a military completion card from 90s, it does say, but the more recent ones don't. But then if you go get your military record, it can potentially reflect that. But yes, your military card, all of them look the same.
Potentially,
why is
it's
that?
not reliable. Yeah.
Like, why doesn't it show on the cards?
I really don't know. It's one of those things. The regime decides that this is how they're doing it. I don't know, Kaveh, if you know.
No, it's a mystery to me too.
Right.
Interesting.
So let's go
and
into
now
that.
I'm sure they request all those records from now. I mean, I'm sure that they do because I see them requesting them for all sorts of clients. Like as soon as they know that you're with you've performed a certain type of military service for various countries, they ask for it. But whether or not it's going to show up there is anybody's guess. But I just wanted to add that if you're wondering what we're talking about with this whole top half test, you need to watch the episode 2 episodes ago. I can't remember what number we're on right now. Steve will, but 2 episodes back with Connie, and we really dive deep into what that top half test is.
Yeah, and so going to the designation, Kaveh, I think when in your representation of the families of the Ukraine International Air, I think it was Flight 752, they were calling for the IRGC to be designated a terrorist organization. The liberals at the time were saying that one of their hesitations was concerns about conscripts. And so this seemed to delay, or possibly, delaying it was what happened, the designation. Were you part of, in representing the families, kind of the lobbying or discussions with the government as to how they could designate the IRGC as a terrorist organization without it impacting the conscripts?
Yeah, so the demand to list the IRGC as a terror organization wasn't really limited just to the Association of the Families of PS752. That has been, or had been, a long-standing demand of a lot of human rights and democracy activists that work on Iran, and I consider myself one. And so in a variety of different contexts and capacities, I had been involved in pushing the government to list the IRGC, and I had been part of the sort of meetings with government officials. And as you say, we had been repeatedly told that the government's interested in doing this. Well, actually, the story changed over time. Initially, the thinking was, or the what we were told was, the government doesn't want to list the IRGC. The IRGC is an arm of the Iranian government, and therefore it would be highly unusual to list it as a terror group. As the political stance shifted a little bit, the government became more open to listing the IRGC, especially after the U.S. listed them. But the argument always was, we're trying to find a way to do this responsibly. We want to list the IRGC, but in a way so as to not harm ordinary people that were forced to go and do their military service there. And my sense is, quite frankly, that was just a stalling tactic. Nobody was really spending a ton of time in the Canadian government thinking about this issue, but they figured that this was a way to buy some time. And then suddenly, one day we just turned on the news and we heard that Canada was going to list the IRGC. I think the impetus for it was that there was a by-election happening in a Toronto riding that has a heavily Jewish, it's got a Jewish population. Their concern was that the Trudeau government wasn't doing enough to protect Israel, and so this decision was hastily made, even though they'd had a long time to think about it and to work out the kinks. And they suddenly announced that the IRGC was going to be listed, but frankly, no carve out was created for those that had been forced to serve. Almost no protection was provided. The next day, I was called into a briefing meeting with the community and so on, just a few sort of folks in the community that had pushed for this. And I posed the question to the folks that were there. I said, well, what protection was built in for the conscripts? And the answer was nothing really. And I actually remember getting quite angry, probably at the wrong people. I mean, these were sort of civil servants that I was talking to, saying, you guys told us that you were going to spend, you told us that you couldn't do this, that you were going to spending a ton of time thinking about this issue. And now that you've made the determination to actually list the IRGC, you've taken no steps to protect conscripts. Very, very irresponsibly done, in my view.
Yeah. Before we get to the immigration consequences and some of what like Ali is seeing, how does the diaspora think in general about the consequences of the designation? Like, I know that sort of in the past few years, there have been a lot of reports about concerns that senior officials of the Iranian government are in Canada. I think I remember watching a video of someone walking or running on a treadmill in Montreal or Ottawa maybe, and there was the headline like, this guy is like someone very senior. And I remember, Pierre Poilievre, I think, wrote a letter in support of trying to hurry up someone's immigration processing, and then it came out that person was involved in the Iranian government. But I haven't really seen, outside of the immigration consultant community, or heard what the general sentiment is towards the IRGC in general and all conscripts.
Yeah, so I mean, it's, as Ali would also tell you, it's difficult to say what the Iranian diaspora thinks about any topic. Wide disagreement on a great many things. But I think on this, there was probably something close to a consensus, which is that people are incredibly, incredibly angry at the fact that ordinary Iranians that want to come to Canada either to live here or that just want to come as tourists or visit family and so on, it's incredibly difficult for them to get the visa to come here. And it's a whole process, and oftentimes they're rejected and so on. But as you say, I mean, they turn on the TV, or not even turn on the TV. I mean, if you're a member of the Iranian community, you walk around and you talk to people, and you can easily see that there are people with ties to the regime that can come here, very high-ranking officials. So the example you gave was actually the mayor of Tehran that had been implicated in great many human rights violations and killings, and he was in Thornhill just working out at his gym, and his family is here and living quite comfortably here, and he's just one example. There are many. So Iranians in Canada are very, very angry about this general sort of inequity built into the system, where people with no ties to the regime find it so difficult to come here. And despite all the rhetoric that our government and our opposition have, it's very easy for those with ties to the regime to come. And the IRGC terror listing, I would say that post 2022, when an uprising began in Iran, the Woman Life Freedom movement, there was I would say a lot of support for the listing, but regrettably, I think a lot of people weren't thinking about this negative consequence where you have a policy that's far too broad and it ends up catching the wrong people. Now that the policy is in place, I hear from a lot of people saying, we should have maybe thought this through. And my answer always is like, yeah, we were thinking about this. We were talking to the government about it. It's just the government didn't do it in the responsible way that we had advised.
Yeah. And so, Ali, maybe before we get into what you're seeing with the conscripts and the state of some of the federal court cases, do you want to do just an overview of what it means for an individual to be alleged to have been a member of a terrorist organization, and sort of just how the 34(1)(f) test works?
Of course, yeah, for sure. So 34(1)(f) basically is the provision that we have under the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act that really is designed to capture those people who are members of terrorist organization. I was again listening to the podcast that you guys did earlier on 35(1)(b), and we were talking about, the reason the high creation of CBSA or even IRPA itself. You got to keep in mind, IRPA came in 2002, and one of the major reasons behind it was in the wake of 9/11 attack and the response to this growing concerns over security and terrorist attacks. So 34(1)(f) was created to capture and render inadmissible those individuals who are found to be members of a terrorist organization. And of course, you're dealing with one of the most important topics for Canadians when it comes down to immigration, which is this issue of security. So naturally, it was defined very broadly. And I think there are several things in it that is very, very important, which is the definition of membership is defined very broadly. The burden of proof is very, very low. And ultimately what you end up getting is, it seems like at the time we decided, even if someone we think there might be involved with a terrorist organization, we might as well just render them inadmissible, and then they can go through some other kind of remedy for us to undo that. And now 25 years later, almost, the reality is very different with how, our understanding of terrorist organizations have changed, and how a lot of these organizations are not part of the state. So 341F is really basically there to capture those people who are part of terrorist organizations.
To me, to put it like in really clear terms, like the purpose of the legislation is to get the bad guys, not to get any like very tenuous connection between this organization and that person. Like, to me, that is what the intention of the legislation is. And while like none of the advocates, including all of us, are against the idea of getting the bad guy, that doesn't mean that it should be set up in such a broad way that anyone with any remote or tenuous connection, like that's what Mason was about, right? And so that principle should be applied in all things, that not because like a line could be drawn between you and that organization, that means you should be banned, but that if some culpability can be demonstrated, then yes, of course, like nobody's going to argue with you.
And I had one of my, sorry, go ahead, Steven.
Oh, I was just going to say, like, on paper, I was kind of supporting what both of you say. Like, the law makes sense, right? I mean, no, I don't think if you hear a law that on its face just says, oh, you can't come to Canada if you were a member of a terrorist organization, you would think that's logical, like that. And then the way the law is designed, even when it's, okay, we're going to cast a wide net, but then we'll look at ministerial relief and actually analyze the circumstances, you would think that makes sense until you see in the statistics that those assessments typically take over a decade.
They're not a thing. Like, it's not a real thing.
Yeah, well, it's on the paper, right? Like when they're drafting the legislation, it's drafted with a concept in mind and how it will work, and it doesn't work that way. Just to also add, before we get to some of the stuff that you've seen, Ali, some of the other consequences of being inadmissible for membership in a terrorist organization is there's no humanitarian and compassionate consideration given. Like, that's it.
Yeah.
You could have been a permanent resident, maybe these are some of your cases, for 20 years, and that doesn't matter how long you've lived in Canada, it doesn't matter if you have children here. The fact that you were a member of this organization, if that's how they determine, makes it such that you're inadmissible. And the other part, which
it doesn't matter if you were conscripted, you had no choice.
Well, we're gonna get, I don't know, I mean, I think that's some of the cases. I don't want to necessarily prejudge Ali's cases and where this will go, because I think that's a live issue. But the other aspect is it doesn't matter how long ago you served. And this may also change as a result of some of the case law that's expanding post-Mason, but what your role in the organization was. So maybe, Ali, you can talk about like some of the, obviously without naming people, some of the like fact patterns, to use the law school term, that you're coming across.
Yeah, I'll get into a few, because I think there's the standard fact pattern that you have. Someone who, a male over the age of 18, has to do their mandatory military service without it being in their control. They get assigned to do their mandatory military service at the IRGC. They do it for 2 years. And most of these people who are conscripts, they are really, really assigned to mundane tasks, right? Nothing even remotely close to what you would think it's even the military function of IRGC. People are sitting at desks, just, I don't know, writing down who's showing up to office and who's not. I've got a couple of people who are in charge of watering plants. That's what they were doing. And these people do their mandatory military service. They finish, they go on with their life, have a family, they apply for a visitor visa, study permit, whatever. They come to Canada, all the while disclosing their military service. No issue. For example, your average person gets a study permit, comes to Canada, again, disclosing, not a problem. Postgraduate work permit, they get it, they disclose, not a problem. Now they're applying for PR, 2025, things have changed since 2022. And then now they're getting procedural fairness letters saying, wait a second, we believe you were a member of a terrorist organization because you did your mandatory military service. And what we are seeing, a lot of people who are responding to this, and this has started coming up as of about last summer. There's some cases that predate that. And people don't understand the significance of these procedural fairness letters. They just think like, no, I wasn't one of the bad guys. I can just tell them. And if I tell them that I wasn't, then it should all be okay. They'll understand because I know I'm not one of the bad guys. And they're right. They're like, oh, this was my mandatory military service. I didn't have any choice over it. And some people go and Google or do their own research. Some people have raised the defense of duress, this idea of that I was forced, therefore I didn't have the intention. And they put this in. And what ends up happening is that IRCC visa officers take a look at this, and it's pretty clear that IRGC meets the definition of a terrorist organization, and they say you're a member. Why? Because you were clearly serving your mandatory military service there, and therefore we conclude that you're inadmissible. And duress doesn't really apply because most time, we can get into the whole idea of duress. Duress has a very, very specific definition with multiple different layers and steps that is really geared towards criminal defense, and it doesn't really work in this setting. So that's generally what you see. But you also see other people who are getting caught by this that did their mandatory military service. They had nothing to do with IRGC, but they're getting caught by this mandate. And the reason for that is that under the conscription services, it's very complicated. People get exempt for all kinds of things. For example, if you're flat-footed, you get exempt. If you're a single child and your father is over age of 55, you get exempt. There are all of these very specific criteria. Again, don't quote me on the specifics right now, but there are a lot of specific provisions that they have. For example, I'm going to give you, I am a big soccer fan, and I used to follow when I was in Iran as a child. The IRGC or the government owns some soccer teams. A lot of the soccer players who then become eligible for mandatory military service, rather than going and wasting 2 years during the peak athletic time, they can go play for the government team, and that would just count towards their military service. There are people who are professors, can continue to teach at universities, and that could count towards their military service. Now, the internal policy that the government has to say, for example, if you were a professor at university, we can count that towards it. How they categorize it, they say, oh, we'll implement this policy under the IRGC branch. You had nothing to do with IRGC. You are teaching at a public university that is not owned by IRGC. You're not teaching anything related to IRGC. You're not reporting to anyone at IRGC. You have absolutely no tie. Your only tenuous connection is that internally, the government processed this as an IRGC military service.
Or you're playing football because the guys that are at the top love football. That's your connection to this terrorist organization.
And
that was another country. Our firm acted for someone who played for the basketball team of an army, and it led to problems.
So that's really what you're dealing with. And then when you come, you're like, well, you were clearly doing this, and this is related to IRGC, and therefore you're inadmissible.
And I would imagine they would have wanted to pay you a lot of money, so you might have had to rank quite high. So like all that stuff, like I don't know, like I don't understand how that works.
So people conscripts get paid. Like I don't know, Kaveh, maybe you know this, but like I would say maybe like $20 a month if we were to convert to Canadian. Like the conscripts are not really paid anything because you kind of have to do it, and the government doesn't really compensate you meaningfully at all. Again, these are just mundane tasks that most of these people are doing.
They're just giving you credit for time served, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
And the big problem is that our system, like what Kaveh was saying, they rushed through this whole thing. And IRCC, a lot of what we are seeing is that they don't understand all of these nuances of how conscription works in these countries. And they are just doing a blanket application. Imagine you just shoot at sight. You don't even look at whether the person is the hostage or the hostage taker. You just shoot at sight. And therefore, what you get is a really unfair law. And one of the big problems is that IRCC just overnight, if you think about IRGC, that's been they've been involved, like Kaveh said, for years and years in terrorist activities, but it was overnight the switch at IRCC that now we're going to go after Iranian men who served in the military service without any consultation with any of the stakeholders. There are organizations, people like Kaveh, organizations that know a lot more than IRCC does about how the system works and how this could perhaps be implemented. As far as I know, I was part of the Iranian Canadian legal professionals, and I've talked to other colleagues. I don't know any organization that was consulted by IRCC to find out how they should implement this. So they're just going in without talking to the stakeholders, without talking to the Iranian diaspora that's here, and they're implementing the law in a way that is just nonsensical.
Can I just ask, Kaveh, would you reiterate that you're not aware of any organization that was consulted on this in a like strategic, systemic way? I'm just curious.
And by IRCC specifically?
Not to my knowledge. I mean, we had meetings with, and I think I'm aware of all the meetings that were happening, various government officials, elected officials. But to my knowledge, civil servants, the folks that actually sit down and write the nuanced legislation and regulation, I don't think they consulted with anybody.
And are you aware of any like training that's happened at the officer decision maker level about how this should be implemented on the ground?
I am not aware of such training. This is actually something that we've recommended after the listing was carried out. We've asked that people be trained, and I think the easy answer to that would have been, yes, we're doing this training, but no one's told me that that's what they're doing. So I assume that means that no such training is taking place.
And do you think you would know if like the training was happening by the stakeholders that really understand the issues?
I think that kind of training, I would know about it, and I think it would be useful. But and I think it would make a difference. I mean, I think the visa officers would approach these things with much more nuanced understanding. But that's not what seems to be happening.
It is a training issue, like the way the law currently is, and with the uncertainty. Like once that organization is designated a terrorist organization, I think it would need to be at almost a public policy at the ministerial level. Like I would put this more at the politicians than the
you're probably right.
itself. Like
you're probably right. But I mean, somebody has to get it onto the track, and if it doesn't enter the track in the first place, if the officer, like once it's in the judicial sphere, then it's kind of like, what does membership mean? You have to go through jurisprudence. There's a lot of bad jurisprudence, yada, yada. They don't want to distinguish.
But that's what I mean, right? Like there's jurisprudence that Ali and others are trying to change. But like,
totally. But that takes a lot of time. But somebody puts
not
it
to
on
give like
course.
recommend, but this really to me like is something at the political public policy level.
It's both.
Obviously, you all are the immigration law experts. My feeling is that two things are needed. One is just training, and the second is some guidance or clarifying
100%.
statements that go to visa officers that tell them, this, notwithstanding the fact that we've got this listing, there are, conscripts, and we have to, assess them on a particular basis. We don't have any of those things. We don't have the training. We don't have the guidance, regrettably.
Yeah.
Ali, what is the state of the cases right now? Obviously, it's too new for a judge to have decided the issue, but what sort of arguments are being made?
Right. And I think this is the really fascinating part. The arguments, I'm aware of about 4 or 5 cases that are being actively litigated at the federal court. And as you said, I don't believe any of the cases have yet passed the leave stage to go before a judge for a decision. One of the main arguments that are being put forward by a lot of people is this argument of duress. Now, there are challenges with this duress argument. Again, specifically in this context, I think there is some merits to it, and I think it could be potentially argued specifically if it was raised for the officer that the person joined in duress. But I think a big one here is about the definition of membership and really needing to sit down and talk about what it means to be a member. You guys talked about this in your 2 previous podcasts that, for the longest time, we've just been having this really broad definition about, what is a terrorist organization, who should be part of terrorist organization. But now it's getting to a point, it's like, no. Yes, we have to be broad, but we also need to be more specific. And I think the issue of membership really becomes the crux of arguments, or should be here. Because the idea is someone a member of an organization simply because they serve their mandatory military service? And my submission to you, like what I would want to pursue, is that it does not. And why doesn't it? Because from a common sense perspective, in Iran, if you want to go join IRGC, you can't just go knock on the door and be like, I want to join IRGC. You've got to go through a rigorous process of questioning, background check, in order to even be considered for something like that. These people who are serving their mandatory military service, I would say maybe they're associated, but they're not a member. And what the officers are doing right now, they're saying, well, you were there for 2 years, therefore you were a member. And I think in case law, what you have around membership, the federal court has been clear that when someone disputes membership, then the officer has to engage in a bit of a more detailed analysis. And the case law really talks about the fact that you need to look at the nature of the organization. You have to look at the person's commitment to the goals and objective of the organization, and the length of time for the involvement. And when you look at those three main factors and you look at a conscript, on the spectrum, they would fall really towards the, to the end that shows they are not a member. So I think officers, if they engage in this analysis of are they a member, then I think, the case comes from B74, the conclusion should be that they're not a member. But what is happening right now, and some of the Rule 9 reasons that I've seen, is that the officers are just foregoing that. They're saying, you did your mandatory military service, you were part of this organization, therefore you're a member for this purpose.
This is exactly what I meant by frontline training. Like, they
that's
should
exactly
be put on that
you.
course, because, like, yes, you can go into judicial review and be like, you didn't apply your own test, but like that's 3 years later, you actually get to your hearing, and in the meantime, you're like proclaimed terrorist by IRCC.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a nice life to be living.
No.
Like, that's hell.
It is. It is infuriating, the people who are getting caught by this. You're talking about people who've come to Canada, have had children, who have established their life for 7 to 8 years, and now they're getting caught by this. And I completely agree with you that the training around membership becomes important. But also, Stephen, what you said, that it's on the political stage, it is as well. All it takes is for ministerial instructions saying, when you're dealing with conscript, you should take a look at this. But you asked about whether there's been training. I don't know whether there's been, but I've seen some of these Rule 9 reasons. It just... I
think the training probably is saying that they should be inadmissible, right? Like,
yeah, for sure.
Right.
That's for sure what the training says. I mean, I think it needs to be at like the highest. I think
it has to be both. 100% has to be both. Because but
they're not, without the people who are doing the training manuals aren't going to, if it's not coming down from the top, I don't see why they would deviate possibly from what the politicians or their superiors are saying.
Yeah, you're right. It has to be my ministerial instruction, as Ali says.
One thing that I wanted to just drive kind of home, and maybe you can comment on as well. Like, so when I first started, as someone who's not Persian and hasn't been to Iran or anything, when I first started encountering individuals who had served in the IRGC, I would ask, like, okay, so what's you got conscripted into the IRGC, not the general army? Is that are you more religious? Do you have a greater fervor for the spreading the revolution? And there really is no connection to it as far as I can tell, right? I think that's just something I want, to bring back, and maybe you can comment on, Ali. The people who are getting caught up aren't fanatics. They're not diehard Ayatollah Iranian regime, supporters. Maybe you could just comment.
Yes. So I think for the most part, you are right. There are, again, we don't know, because you're talking about a dictatorship where the laws and the rules are not so transparent. There's this argument, as a, let's say, pro-regime student, you can join this other organization called the Siege, right? Which is, these are people, maybe Kaveh can discuss this a bit more. And the idea is that those guys who are committed to the Islamic Republic from the very early on, those people get some kind of a privileged position once they do their mandatory military service. But for the most part, if you're going to, the fact that you've served at IRGC is by no way an indicator of your proximity or your commitment to the Islamic Republic itself.
But I'm just thinking of like when we apply the Ribic test in like residency obligation appeals, we look in a very substantive way about like you haven't met the residency obligation in Canada, but let's look very carefully at why you left Canada and what brought you back. You know, like we look qualitatively at what all these factors were, but we don't do that when it talks to like belonging to this organization, membership. Like there's no substantive evaluation of any of it.
It's the opposite. There's a line of jurisprudence which says that if you admit to being a member, you don't have to analyze anything else, including even if they know what member means in the immigration law context.
Exactly.
No,
even if it's like, you know, you were threatened if you don't like if you were held at gunpoint when you did your like, and I'm not saying that these are actual examples, but certainly I've seen this in other regimes where it's like, you know, like it's nothing to do with that. It's just, was there a line that can be drawn between person and said organization? Done.
And honestly, and you can, I think the best example of that comes when you look at the burden of proof. When it comes down to 34, 35, and 37, you got reasonable grounds to believe. When I'm explaining to the clients what this means, is that, you know, I was saying like, you know, if this was a game of basketball, balance of probabilities means I get, 51 points, you get 50 points, right? Reasonable grounds to believe is that if I lose 30-70, I got 30 points, you got 70 points, I still win, right? So you really got to win 90-10 in these cases. So that means even if you're 70-80% sure that this person is not a terrorist, we're still gonna say they're a terrorist just because to be safe, and that's just
to be safe.
Yeah,
just in case we're wrong, or just in case every single word out of your mouth is bullshit, then we're just gonna go with no.
Well, because they have ministerial relief, and that'll only take a decade. Right. Just looking at the time left, I was being sarcastic there for those who may not have picked it up. Just looking at the time, we had a lot of questions before and some that have come in now that I just want to flag and discuss in the 10 minutes just that we have left. First, Mahar, who's an immigration consultant in North Vancouver, says that it depends on the completion card. Some of his clients do have cards which say that they held the rank in the IRGC. So it may depend on when someone served and when they served. One question that we got, so I'll just throw them up in order. I was convicted years ago just to do labor work, such as cleaning, washing, and guard posting for 2 years. The Iranian government stole my life once. We were mere slaves and not officials. That sounds similar to the types of some of the cases you're dealing with, Ali.
You made a really, you called it convicted rather than conscripted, but
most of these people are people who are running away from this regime.
Totally.
I've got clients who've got young daughters who are terrified of going back after what happened with Mahsa Amini, who are terrified of the life that their children have to live under this regime. And now imagine you're running away from that. People who've taken part in protests here to protest the Islamic Republic. And now the Canadian government is coming saying, we think you're part of those guys. It's just,
Well, so that's this person. We fled a brutal regime and legally built our lives in Canada. We weren't members. You don't just sign up. One thing we haven't touched on, and either Deanne or Ali can comment, is does this preclude a refugee claim? This finding of inadmissibility?
1,000%.
What do you mean?
Yeah.
Well, so if someone was a member of the IRGC, can they still claim asylum in Canada?
No, because you're going to be excluded.
Yep.
And then you get restricted prod.
The minister will 100% intervene in the refugee claim. They're going to like rake you over the coals through the entire.
I have people. I've spoken with people who arrived at the airport, and it's interesting what's happening. A lot of these people who got their visa, they're arriving at the airport. At the airport, CBSA is asking them, "Wait a second, where did you do your, conscription?" And it's so interesting. who is going to disclose that they serve in IRGC? I'm going to tell you, it's the most honest, straightforward conscript who's going to do it. If you are an actual person, a high rank at IRGC, not only are you not going to disclose, but you have connections to be able to produce whatever records that they want to show that they had no connection with IRGC. So this law will only catch those people who are honest, straightforward, and most likely didn't have anything to do with it.
But also, if you didn't disclose it because of you're one of these people who made the comment below, that's not because you're like you're so culpable that now you're inadmissible for misrepresentation. It's because they know that they will probably stop you from entering, and you need to flee this brutal regime, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like. Mm-hmm. I get it. I understand misrepresentation means that you're inadmissible for not having said it in advance. But like, honestly, like, what are you supposed to do? Stay and continue to be subjected to the brutal regime? Like, I just doesn't.
I mean, there's case law around around refugee claims that says, you know, if you're misrepresenting in order to flee, there's an exemption on that. But then again, you're still a member, and therefore you get rendered inadmissible anyways.
Yeah. So we've talked about training.
Right.
Different opinions on whether that is the solution. But one question is, who actually decides on admissibility? Is this IRCC? Is this CBSA?
That's
most of what it sounds like you're experiencing with procedural fairness letters. I assume it's both, I guess, is the answer.
So just so that people understand, so it's usually going to be IRCC if the inadmissibility finding is being made as part of an application. For example, you've applied for a study permit, visitor visa, work permit, PR, and IRCC has to determine your admissibility. And if they have concern, they will send you a procedural fairness letter. But also CBSA on its own initiative can issue a Section 44(1) report when they want to issue removal orders. And usually going through the CBSA route is actually much better because you get to have a hearing before the immigration division, which allows you to testify, present evidence, and the decision maker is a semi-independent board member as opposed to an IRCC officer.
Both of these organizations are like sleeping giants, right? As soon as you poke it, then they will and so different types of applications poke a different one of the giants. Like if you're making an application for something, that giant is IRCC. If you're trying to enter the country through a border or something like that, then it's CBSA. But as Ali says, they can also do it of their own initiative. In the refugee claims process, it's that the minister can intervene. And so like they're all sorts of different iterations, but it's specific to the very set of circumstances that is what causes the government to interface with the facts.
Yeah. These conscripts were opposed to IRGC policies. Many took part in the Masha Amini movement gatherings. I think that's what you had referenced, Kaveh, when you talked about how this started. Some of the pressure to designate more of the regime kind of reached a fever pitch during these protests. I remember them in Vancouver because was one of the only protests that didn't actually block streets. And I don't know if you're familiar with Vancouver, but there was like people wearing white elbow to elbow, like linking arms, going from it was incredible, going from like Georgia and Burrard over the Lionsgate Bridge.
Yeah, the same was held in Toronto. We had them from
it was the same in Toronto.
Yeah, we had them from Richmond Hill. If you know Toronto, Richmond Hill all the way down to the lake. So it was very impressive. Didn't block traffic, and it was.
But just the length of it, it was one of the most impressive things I've actually seen in Vancouver.
It's a very beautiful protest, actually. That's very evocative.
Yeah, and my daughter, who was 2 at the time, thought they were like applauding and cheering her on. So the whole thing, but it was all just very memorable. But I guess from this question, we've talked about conscripts, and if somebody was a conscript, but it can also be confirmed that they took part in anti-regime events, does that change the inadmissibility finding?
Unfortunately, it doesn't, because like you said, once a terrorist, always a terrorist. You talked about the consequence of Section 34. One of my colleagues once defined it as the kiss of death. And it really is that once you're labeled with that, you could be Mahatma Gandhi himself, and it doesn't undo it, right? You still need a ministerial
Right.
relief.
Because you don't have a pre-removal risk assessment, right? Because you're
and it's just, and it doesn't undo it. It doesn't make you now, So again, it's so unfair. And I just wanted to give a shout out to, the individuals who reached out to you about this podcast. There's a group of Iranians who are here. There's a group on one of these applications called Telegram. There's over 500 members in there, and all of them are somehow caught by this issue. A lot of them have their applications pending background check for several years. A lot of them are afraid of doing mandamus applications because they're afraid to do a mandamus application and they'll be
why would you want to hasten that finding being made? Yeah, exactly.
And these people are really grasping for straws, trying to get the attention of the politicians, trying to really have some people hear their voice, because these are just ordinary people getting caught by this. And I just want to give a shout out to them, and that they've done an excellent job. And there is a website that they have for immigration professionals, anyone who wants to kind of go and learn more about this. I think it's fcica.ca, just Canadian Conscript Right Association.
FCICA.ca.
Yes, even if you Google Iranian Canadian Conscript Right Association, they're really trying to have their voices heard. And again, I'm sure they really appreciate.
But I think it's just really what's scary about it is that this is arising at a moment in time where where open-mindedness and people's ability to engage in a open, humane way to people's experiences is at an all-time low. And so the cases are amassing, but is this the moment I want to be in front of a judge or in front of the media, or this is the worst possible time I can imagine in Canada's entire history since I was born in the 70s, for this issue to be raised. I've never seen such a terrible political climate in Canada. So if I would want to be rushed, because living with this, being tagged with the organization that I specifically fled seems like the worst possible time in my life. But at the same time, this is not the audience I would want to have judging it. And the affordability, to be able to it's probably not going to be decided by the federal court or the Federal Court of Appeal. It's probably going to be decided by the Supreme Court of Canada, as Mason has shown, and as Connie's case is showing on so anyways, it's just it's very complicated. So
you're 100% correct on that.
I want to just close out with this last one. We've touched on it before, but kind of what is either the most, I predicted it, so I can't say it's surprising, but disappointing in that I was right, was that, as Kaveh, you were saying, there were meetings after meetings where we want to protect the conscripts, and then just political pressure, poof, nothing came of it. Just to confirm and reiterate, as far as, and you would probably be the one to know, the department isn't reaching out to people. There's no ongoing discussions about this at the political level. Is that right?
As far as I know, yeah.
Okay. And I think this question, sorry, that they say, why has the government not officially exempted conscript from IRGC designation? I think it goes back, just to touch on Deanna's earlier point, and maybe to wrap up, is that I think a big problem here is that it's going to be very unpopular for you to go to, and say, maybe we should exempt some of these people who are potentially terrorists. It could be kind of twisted that way so easily. And the government just doesn't want to get at all close to this. And training and actually taking the time is going to be costly for the government that has over 1 million application in backlog. So they are just trying to, again, go through these things as fast as possible without really paying attention. And really unfair what's happening.
With Deanna about this, Ryan Rosenberg, a partner here, and I had dinner with a former immigration minister who was talking about how he didn't like how broad Section 34 was, but politically, the amount of political capital that would have to be expended, and then if there was ever a negative consequence where someone was admitted, say from the IRGC, and there was an ongoing connection, they would be hammered. It will take the expenditure of political capital to do it. Oh, without a doubt.
I think that's exactly right. If I may just jump in for one concluding thought, that's exactly right. I mean, there's no incentive at the moment for any politician to step up and try to fix this problem. The headline is going to be, and if one bad person gets in, the headline is politician X allowed IRGC officer to get in, right? And so I think it's really incumbent upon us to kind of make these nuanced arguments and work with the folks, not necessarily the politicians, though a politician could potentially solve this, but the people that can sort of tweak the regulations, the people that could give legal interpretations that would solve this. I have kind of stepped forward. I was within the Iranian community, I was one of the loudest voices calling for the IRGC designation, and now I see it sort of as my responsibility to push for these exemptions, because I didn't want this outcome. This was not what I'd hoped for. And I really do hope that others that pushed for this speak out to give some political cover, hopefully, to politicians that want to fix this problem. If somebody like me says, look, this thing that I advocated for isn't quite working out as I'd hoped, hopefully that gives a politician some cover to be able to actually say the same thing.
So for me, it's like when I was like thinking about going into law school, I remember hearing the phrase again and again, like, tough cases make bad law. And I'm not just talking about the IRGC, but I'm just talking about like the political climate right now and all of the many conflicts going on. It's like I understand that making laws and policies in this political climate is extremely, extremely difficult. And so I'm not saying like this should be easy, but I'm saying that like rather than doing things fast, get the very smartest people into the room to strategize about it, and then to know that you're going to have to keep pivoting, and it's going to cost a bit more money, but like otherwise it's going to cost way more money or way more damage or trouble or whatever. And so like, but that's why it's like, why aren't the smartest, like, why aren't you both in the room and talking about these things and actually actively being involved in developing policies? And that's not just on this issue, it's about a whole bunch of other ones, but like, that's how it needs to happen. And I think that like, okay, so the final comment, the Canadian Bar Association just wrote a report about like IRPA modernization and all that sort of thing. And I think that the key message was like, yes, we understand we want efficiency and we want modernization and it's a big backlog and yada, 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 but like, you have to go back to what are the principles? What are we trying to do? Yes, we're trying to keep people safe, but we're also trying to be fair. We're trying to be equitable. We're trying to like meet these values and all this kind of stuff. And so like, can we slow it down for a second and be thoughtful and like, smart?
Yeah,
we need to be smart.
There are no cases yet that, as I said earlier, that has gone to the federal court. So just a message for all of our colleagues out there who are perhaps dealing with this issue. It becomes very, very important that we set the precedents correctly when this issue is being litigated first time. I'm really trying to push for an effort that we can have a kind of a consolidated effort where we are all on the same page. I'm more than happy to share information, and I think it would be really, really good to make sure we can set the tone right from the beginning. I know we're at time. Stephen, I'll let you take it.
Yeah, like I don't take these cases because I don't know enough about Iran. That's how serious. Like, and it's not that I'm not smart and that I couldn't have asked all my friends, but like my friends who know this, like Connie or one of you, like, like it needs to be by a subject matter expert, like who does a lot of this type of work. It's not a good one for me to cut my teeth on. Like,
awesome. Well, thanks for coming on. This was great.
Super enlightening. Amazing.
I hope it at least shed light and offered at least a glimmer of like, it's not certain yet for those who are facing allegations. Ali mentioned there were no cases that had gone to the federal court. I think what he means is there have been no hearings or decisions yet because it's actively being litigated, and where this all ends remains to be seen.
We will be watching.
Really appreciate